Yeah, that actually doesn't mean anything good because you start with preferred outcomes and preferred conclusions and end up trying to twist evidence into supporting that conclusion rather than finding out whether what you think is correct is actually correct. Longtime viewers on this channel know that I have been very critical of Scientific American. Now, there are occasionally things that are good quality that have been put out there in the last few years. I've noticed that that magazine seems to be something of a dumpster fire, as it were. And I was curious myself as to why, because of the age of Scientific American. And then I stumbled across this piece in the City Journal called Unscientific American, which actually details some of the fall of Scientific American quite nicely. And so I thought it was worth a read. It is a bit long, I will say, so I don't think we'll go through exactly all of it, but I will make sure to hit the highlights for you. But as always, this is linked in the description, so I encourage you to go read it and, tell me what you think of what the authors are saying, as always, with that. So let us get into it from James, I'm going to say Meigs or Meigs, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. Unscientific American, Science Journalism Surrenders to Progressive Ideology. Michael Shermer got his first clue that things were changing at Scientific American in late 2018. The author had been writing his Skeptic column for the magazine since 2001. His monthly essays, aimed at an audience of both scientists and laymen, championed the scientific method, defended the need for evidence-based debate, and explored how cognitive and ideological biases can derail the search for the truth. Shermer's role models included two 20th century thinkers who, like him, relished explaining science to the public: Carl Sagan, the ebullient astronomer and TV commentator, and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a popular monthly column in Natural History magazine for 25 years. Shermer hoped someday to match Gould's record of producing 300 consecutive columns. That goal would elude him. In continuous publication since 1845, Scientific American is the country's leading mainstream science magazine. Authors published in its pages have included Albert Einstein, Francis Crick, Jonas Salk, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, some 200 Nobel Prize winners in all. SciAm, as many readers call it, had long encouraged its authors to challenge established viewpoints. In the mid-20th century, for example, the magazine published a series of articles building the case for the then radical concept of plate tectonics. In the 21st century, however, American scientific media, including Scientific American, began to slip into lockstep with progressive beliefs. Suddenly, certain orthodoxies, especially concerning race, gender, or climate, couldn't be questioned. Quote, "I started to see the writing on the wall towards the end of my run there," Shermer told me. "I saw I was being slowly nudged away from certain topics." One month, he submitted a column about the fallacy of excluded exceptions, a common logical error in which people perceive a pattern of causal links between factors, but ignore counterexamples that don't fit the pattern. In the story, Shermer debunked the myth of the horror film Curse, which asserts that bad luck tends to haunt actors who appear in scary movies. The actors in most horror films survive unscathed, he noted, while bad luck sometimes strikes the cast of non-scary movies as well. Shermer also wanted to include a serious example: the common belief that sexually abused children grow up to be abusers in turn. He cited evidence that most sexually abused children do not grow up to abuse their own children, and that most abusive parents were not abused as children. And he observed how damaging this stereotype could be to abuse survivors. Statistical clarity is all the more vital in such delicate cases, he argued. But Shermer's editor at the magazine wasn't having it. To the editor, Shermer's effort to correct the common misconception might be read as downplaying the seriousness of abuse. Even raising the topic might be too traumatic for victims. The following month, Shermer submitted a column discussing ways that discrimination against racial minorities, gays, and other groups has diminished while acknowledging the need for continued progress. Here, Shermer ran into the same wall that Better Angels of Our Nature author Steven Pinker and other scientific optimists had faced. For progressives, admitting that any problem, racism, pollution, poverty, has improved means surrendering the rhetorical high ground. They are committed to the idea, quote, they are committed to the idea that there is no cumulative progress, Shermer says, and they angrily resist efforts to track the true prevalence or the base rate of a problem, saying that everything is wonderful and everyone should stop whining doesn't really work, his editor objected. Shermer dug his grave deeper by quoting Manhattan Institute fellow Heather McDonald and the Coddling of the American Mind authors Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, who argue that the rise of identity group politics undermines the goal of equal rights for all. Shermer wrote that intersectional theory, which lumps individuals into aggregate groups based on race, sex, and other immutable characteristics, is a perverse inversion of Martin Luther King's dream of a colorblind society. For Shermer's editors at Scientific American, that is, apparently this was the last straw. The column was killed and Shermer's contract terminated. Apparently SciAm no longer had the ideological bandwidth to publish such a heterodox thinker. So this is Michael Shermer, from Michael Shermer's perspective, what's going on here. And it is true, Scientific American is a very long storied history, and lots of great things that were published in it in its older history. Sadly, it's no longer, I think, because I do agree with the prevailing sentiment that Scientific American seems far more interested in ideology and what have you. And what strikes me as actually a fine example of that is it was at one point that Scientific American, oh gosh, it was last year, it was the year before. It was the same year that was the Dobbs decision, so I think it was last year. But they published this thing, it was in the same vein as Nature and What Science did, of saying, well, every story is a science story, and talking about how SCOTUS was anti-science and what have you. But the truth is, like, not every story is a science story at all. Because, for example, a lot of the things that SCOTUS has to deal with is deciding the legality and whether or not the government has the authority under the Constitution to do what it's doing. It doesn't necessarily matter whether the scientific side says it's for good or for ill, that it should be, that it should be done this way or should be done that way. It doesn't matter. That's a different thing. So no, not every story is a science story involved in these things. Not every question to be answered is a science question per se. And so there's a lot of things like that struck me in the last few years in sort of, how do I put this? Making it seem like science should be everything when it's not, essentially. Some questions that science doesn't get into answering and it's not part of. So to say somebody's anti-science because they're answering a different question is an interesting thing to me. But let us continue. American journalism has never been very good at covering science. In fact, the mainstream press is generally a cheap date when it comes to stories about alternative medicine, UFO sightings, pop psychology, or various forms of junk science. For many years, that was one factor that made Scientific American's rigorous reporting so vital. The New York Times, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and a few other mainstream publications also produced top-notch science coverage. Peer-reviewed academic journals aimed at specialists met a higher standard still. But over the past decade or so, the quality of science journalism, even at the top publications, has declined in a new and alarming way. Today's journalistic failings don't owe simply to lazy reporting or a weakness for sensationalism, but to a sweeping and increasingly pervasive worldview. It's hard to put a single name on the sprawling ideology. It has its roots in both radical 1960s critiques of capitalism and in the late 20th century postmodern movement that sought to problematize notions of objective truth. I've talked about this before. Postmodernism's relationship to the truth and objective reality is either indifferent or at times very outright hostile, which makes it the antithesis of science, because what is science's purpose? Well, the pursuit of the truth. Critical race theory, which sees structural racism as a grand and organizing principle of our society, and what is one branch, queer studies, obviously intersectionality, I'm not going to go. That in managerial settings, the doctrine lives under the labels of diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI, a set of policies that sound anodyne but in practice are anything but. This dogma sees Western values, in the United States in particular, as a uniquely pernicious force in world history. Let's see. The DEI worldview took over our institutions slowly, then all at once. Many on the left, especially journalists, saw Donald Trump's 2016 election as an existential threat that necessitated dropping the guardrails of balance and objectivity. In an already polarized environment, most media outlets lunged further left. Centrists, including New York Times opinion editor James Bennett and science writer Donald McNeil Jr., were forced out, while radical progressive voices were elevated. Would add into that Barry Weiss leaving the Times, amongst others. This was the national climate when Laura Helmuth took the helm of Scientific American in April of 2020. Helmuth boasted a sterling resume, a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from the University of California, Berkeley, and a string of impressive editorial jobs at outlets including Science, National Geographic, and the Washington Post. Taking over a large print and online media operation during the early weeks of the COVID pandemic could not have been easy. I would agree with that. I mean, there was a lot of crazy stuff that happened in that time. On the other hand, those difficult times represented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for an ambitious science editor. Rarely in the magazine's history had so many Americans urgently needed timely, sensible science reporting. Where did COVID come from? How was it transmitted? Was shutting down schools and businesses scientifically justified? What do we know about vaccines? Scientific American did examine COVID from various angles, including an informative July 2020 cover story diagramming how SARS-CoV-2 virus sneaks inside human cells. But the publication didn't break much new ground in covering the pandemic. When it came to assessing growing evidence that COVID might have escaped from a laboratory, for example, SciAm got scooped by New York and Vanity Fair. I'm guessing that's supposed to be the New York Post. Hold on a second. Oh, New York Magazine. There we go. Yeah, they didn't quite finish what the name of the publication is right here, just FYI. Vanity Fair, publications known more for their coverage of politics and entertainment than of science. But at the same time, SciAm dramatically ramped up its social justice coverage. The magazine would soon publish a flurry of articles with titles such as Modern Mathematics Confronts Its White Patriarchal Past, The Racist Roots of Fighting Obesity. The death of the 20th century's most acclaimed biologist was the hook for The Complicated Legacy of E.O. Wilson, an opinion piece arguing that Wilson's work was, quote, based on racist ideas without quoting a single line from his large published canon. I covered that at the time when that came out. That was a smear job, if ever there was one. At least those pieces had some connection to scientific topics, though. In 2021, SciAm published an opinion essay, Why the Term Jedi is Problematic for Describing Programs That Promote Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. By the way, that one is just... Oh, hang on. We'll get to that in a second. The author's 5 articles took issue with the effort by some social justice advocates to create a cute new label while expanding the DEI acronym to include justice. The Jedi Knights of the Star Wars movies are, quote, inappropriate mascots for social justice, the authors argue, because they are, quote, prone to white saviorism and toxically masculine approaches to conflict resolution, violent deaths, duels with phallic lightsabers, gaslighting by means of Jedi mind tricks, etc. What all this had to do with science was anyone's guess. I gotta admit, I read that article and I was debating covering it here. After the fact, but it was hysterically funny. I'm not gonna lie, it was hysterically funny, and at the same time, it had bullcrap to do with science. It didn't belong in Scientific American. It was far more appropriate for Vox, or Slate, or Axios than it was for Scientific American. It was shit. It was shit. It was so bad. Several prominent scientists took note of SciAm's shift. Quote, Scientific American is changing from a popular science magazine into a social justice in science magazine. Cherry Coyne, a University of Chicago emeritus professor of ecology and evolution, wrote on his blog, Why Evolution is True. He asked why the magazine had changed its mission from publishing decent science to pieces of flawed bits of ideology. Quote, the old Scientific American that I subscribed to in college was all about science. The University of New Mexico evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller told me. It was factual reporting on new ideas and finding from physics to psychology with a clear writing style, excellent illustrations, and no obvious political agenda. Miller says that he noticed a gradual change about 15 years ago, and then a, quote, woke political bias that got more flagrant and irrational over recent years. The leading U.S. science journals, Nature and Science, and the UK-based New Scientist made a similar pivot, he says. By the time Trump was elected in 2016, he says, quote, the Scientific American editors seem to have seem to have decided that fighting conservatives was more important than reporting on science. Indeed, for some reason. Scientific American's increasing engagement in politics drew national attention in late 2020 when the magazine, for the first time in its 175-year history, endorsed a presidential candidate. Quote, the evidence show and the science show that Donald Trump has badly damaged the U.S. and its people. I would note that there was actually no citations in that particular article because I did read it. For that line in particular. The editors wrote, this is why we urge you to vote for Joe Biden. In an email exchange, Scientific American editor-in-chief Helmuth said the decision to endorse Biden was made unanimously by the magazine staff. Overall, the response was very positive, she said. Helmuth pushed back on the idea that getting involved in political battles represented a new direction for SciAm. Quote, we have a long and proud history of covering the social and political angles of science. She said, noting that the magazine has advocated for teaching evolution and not creationism since we covered the Scopes monkey trial. That's different, though, than endorsing a candidate. And I think I said this at the time. I said that at the time to myself when I was reading it. There's like, no, that's different. That's very, very different. Endorsing a candidate is very, very, very different than actually, talking about some of the political angles that affect scientific topics is a different thing than actually endorsing a candidate and putting your weight behind them. And as others have found, that actually shot the credibility of a lot of those publications. Because Nature tried that, and then they did a study on it, which showed that, yeah, you damaged the credibility of the publication when you did that. Scientific American wasn't alone in endorsing a presidential candidate in 2020. Nature also endorsed Biden in that election cycle. The New England Journal of Medicine indirectly did the same, writing that, quote, our current leaders have demonstrated that they are dangerously incompetent and should not keep their jobs. Vinny Prasad, the prominent oncologist and public health expert, recently lampooned the endorsement trend on his Substack, asking whether science journals will tell him who to vote for again in 2024. Here's an idea, call it crazy, he wrote. Why don't scientists just focus on science and let politics decide the election? When scientists insert themselves into politics, he added, the only result is we are forfeiting our credibility. And again, he's right about that. I talked about this at the time when the article came out, but there was a scientist who published in Nature Human Behavior, I believe, if I remember correctly, who did a study on what Nature's endorsement did with regards to the credibility of the journal, but also with the credibility of scientists more generally. The stronger conclusion was that, endorsing Biden when you did basically just shot the credibility of the journal. Congratulations, Nature. And the other thing that happened, of course, is that it did, at least in the survey participants' mind, damage the credibility of scientists writ large. Although that was a much less strong conclusion from the data and everything, and I talked about it at the time it's on this channel. So there is that, and of course Nature decided to double down on stupid, as it were. But that's what they decided to do. But yes, Vinny Prasad is correct in his statement there. But what does it mean to focus on science? Many of us learned the standard model of the scientific method in high school. We understand that science attempts, not always perfectly, to shield the search for the truth from political interference, religious dogmas, or personal emotions and biases. We're not perfect at this. We do try to avoid that, but this is why you need folks with different perspectives so we can identify each other's biases and collectively get at the truth. The French theorist Michel Foucault, big person in the postmodernist movement, by the way, argued that scientific objectivity is an illusion produced and shaped by society's systems of power. Today's woke activists challenge the legitimacy of science on various grounds: the predominance of white males in history, the racist attitudes held by some of its pioneers, and its inferiority to indigenous ways of knowing, and so on. Ironically, as Christopher Rufo points out in his book, America's Cultural Revolution, this postmodern ideology, which began as a critique of oppressive power structures, today empowers the most illiberal, repressive voices within academic and other institutions. Very true. Actually, I would very much agree with that sentiment. Shermer believes that the new style of science journalism is being justified by this postmodernist worldview, the idea that all facts are relative or culturally determined. Of course, if scientific facts are just products of a particular cultural milieu, he says, then everything is a narrative that has to reflect some political side. Without an agreed upon framework to separate valid from invalid claims, without science, in other words, people fall back on their hunches and in-group biases, the my side bias. Traditionally, science reporting was mostly descriptive. Writers strove to explain new discoveries in a particular field. The new style of science journalism takes the form of advocacy. Writers seek to nudge readers toward a politically approved opinion. I disagree with that statement. Advocacy, you do still understand that the truth is there and are willing to modify your opinions and worldview based upon whether or not, your own perceptions line up with actually what the truth is. But seeking to nudge the folks towards a particular worldview and approved opinion is activism. And activism is very much the antithesis of science in here also because activism doesn't care much about what the truth is. Let's see. Lately, journalists have been behaving more like lawyers, Shermer says, marshaling evidence in favor of their own view and ignoring anything that doesn't help their argument. This isn't just the case in science journalism, of course. Even before the Trump era, the mainstream press boosted stories that supported left-leaning viewpoints and carefully avoided topics that might offer ammunition to the right. Most readers understand, of course, that stories about politics are likely to be shaped by the media outlet's ideological slant. But science is theoretically supposed to be insulated from political influence. Sadly, the new woke style of science journalism reframes factual scientific debates as ideological battles, with one side presumed to be morally superior. Not surprisingly, the crisis in science journalism is most obvious in fields where public opinion is most polarized. Let's see. A lot of this section is about the COVID pandemic. So I don't want to dwell too much on that section here, but yeah, because they're talking about the argument over the lab leak versus the natural origins theory of the COVID-19 virus more so, and what happened related to that, which again, you can feel free to go back and read it, but I don't want this video get too long today. As Shermer observed, many science journalists see their role as not as neutral supporters, but as advocates for noble causes. This is especially true when reporting about the climate. Many publications now have reporters on a permanent climate beat, and several nonprofit organizations offer grants to help fund climate coverage. Climate science is an important field worthy of thoughtful, balanced coverage. Unfortunately, too many climate reporters seem especially prone to common fallacies, including base rate neglect and to hyping tenuous data. Yes. And I agree with the sentiment, because I would very much like to see some balanced coverage. But anyway. Most climate journalists wouldn't dream of drawing attention to data that challenges the climate consensus. They see their role as alerting the public to an urgent problem that will only be solved through political change. Similar logic applies to social issues. Any people or institutions that don't participate in this process need to be singled out for criticism. In such an atmosphere, it takes a particularly brave journalist to note exceptions to the reigning orthodoxy. Let's see. In such an overheated environment, it would be helpful to have a journalistic outlet advocating for a sober, evidence-based approach. In an earlier era, Scientific American might have been that voice. Now, what they're talking about here is, because I skipped over a bunch of stuff because they're talking about different topics and what have you and what's happened with respect to science journalism reporting on these different things and some other stuff. So I wanted to skip down to a point here because one of the reasons we could have Scientific American could be a great voice in this if they actually were sober and evidence-based in their handling. I am highly doubtful of that nowadays. In an earlier area, Scientific American might have been that voice. Unfortunately, SciAm today downplays messy debates about gender therapies while offering sunny platitudes about the safety and efficacy of hormone treatments for prepubescent patients. For example, in a 2023 article, What Are Puberty Blockers and How Do They Work?, the magazine repeats the unsubstantiated claim that such treatments are crucial to preventing suicide among gender dysphoric children. The independent journalist Jesse Singal, a longtime critic of science reporting, demolishes these misleading claims in a Substack post. In fact, the use of puberty blockers to treat gender dysphoria is a new and barely researched phenomenon. Singal finds it especially alarming to see a leading science magazine obscure the uncertainty surrounding these treatments. Fortunately, glimmers of light are shining through on the gender care controversy. The New York Times has lately begun publishing more balanced articles on the matter, much to the anger of activists. And various European countries have started reassessing and limiting youth hormone treatments. England's National Health Service recently commissioned the respected pediatrician Hilary Cass to conduct a sweeping review of the evidence supporting youth gender medicine. Her nearly 400-page report is a bombshell, finding that the evidence supporting hormone interventions for children is weak, while long-term risks of such treatments have been inadequately studied. For most young people, the report concludes, a medical pathway will not be the best way to manage gender-related distress. In April, the NHS announced it will no longer routinely prescribe puberty blocking drugs, to children. Scientific American has yet to offer an even-handed review of the new scientific skepticism towards aggressive gender medicine. Oy. Indeed, they do not. Yeah, and then there's stuff like this that gets released here. Shortly after the Cass report's release, Scientific American published an interview with two activists who argue that scientists questioning trans orthodoxy are conducting epistemological violence. There's nothing wrong with vigorous debate over scientific questions. In fact, both science and journalism adversarial argumentation is a vital tool in testing claims and getting to the truth. A bad idea can hover in the ether of a culture if there is no norm for speaking out, Shermer says. Where some trans activists cross the line is in trying to derail debate by shaming and excluding anyone who challenges the activist manufactured consensus. Such intimidation has helped enforce other scientific taboos. Yep. The claim that implicit... there's just a bunch of examples here. But now we get toward the end with this. Scientists and journalists aren't known for being shrieking violets. What makes them tolerate this enforced conformity? The intimidation described above is one factor. Academia and journalism are both notoriously insecure fields. A single accusation can be a career ender. In many organizations, this gives the youngest, most radical members of the community disproportionate power to set ideological agendas. Scientists, science publishers, and science journalists simply haven't learned how to say no to emotionally unhinged activists, continues evolutionary psychologist Miller says. They're prone to emotional blackmail, and they tend to be naive about the political goals of activists who claim that scientific finding X or Y will impose harm on some group. But scientists also may also have what they perceive to be positive motives to self-censor. A fascinating recent paper concludes, quote, pro-social motives underlie censorship by scientists. The authors includes a who's who of heterodox thinkers. We've covered it on this channel before. Our analysis suggests that scientific censorship is often driven by scientists who are primarily motivated by self-protection, benevolence toward peer scholars, and pro-social concerns for the well-being of human social groups. Whether motivated by good intentions, conformity, or fear of ostracization, scientific censorship undermines both the scientific process and public trust. The authors of the pro-social motives paper point to, quote, at least one obvious cost of scientific censorship, the suppression of accurate information. This is the thing. We are about the pursuit of the truth in science. We are about that, yeah? And so if you're suppressing things just because you don't like it, because it's offensive, doesn't support your narrative in the social justice worldview and what have you, well, congratulations. You may have done something to be very maladaptive or actually very, very harmful because you just don't want to hear what the truth is. When scientists claim to represent a consensus about ideas that remain in dispute or avoid certain topics entirely, those decisions filter down through the journalistic food chain. Findings that support the social justice worldview get amplified in the media, while disapproved topics are excoriated as disinformation. Not only do scientists lose the opportunity to form a clearer picture of the world, the public does too. This goes back to something I've been harping on for a while, is people don't think about it, but we place a lot of value on society, on our scientists, our lawyers, and all these other folks who do amazing things. And so we rely on them. And because we rely on them to be truth tellers, to be part of the reality-based community, to say, okay, no, this isn't what you think it is, or wow, yeah, it is what you think it is, and things like that, that's actually a tremendous amount of power there. So when there's a lost opportunity for those people that you trust to form a clear picture of the world, well, then that trickles into the public eventually. At the same time, the public notices when claims made by health officials and other experts prove to be more based in politics than science. A new Pew Research poll finds the percentage of Americans who say they have a great deal of trust in scientists has fallen from 39% in 2020 to 23% today. Whenever research can inform policy decisions, it's important for scientists and science publications to share what we know and how we know it. Communality. Scientific American editor Helmuth says, this is especially true as misinformation and disinformation are spreading so widely. That would be an excellent mission statement for a serious science publication. We live in an era when scientific claims underpin huge swaths of public policy, from COVID to climate to healthcare for vulnerable youths. It has never been more vital to subject those claims to rigorous debate. Unfortunately, progressive activists today begin with their preferred policy outcomes or ideological conclusions and then try to force scientists and journalists to fall in line. The worldview insists that rather than challenging the progressive orthodoxy, science must serve as its handmaiden. This pre-Enlightenment style of thinking used to hold sway only in radical subcultures and arcane corners of academia. Today it is reflected even in our leading institutions and science publications. Without a return to the core principles of science and the broader tradition of fact-based discourse and debate, our society risks drifting onto rocks of irrationality. So, it's an excellent but very long piece. So again, I encourage you to go read it when you have time. Here again, linked in the description. And I mean, the closing part of this is where's the problem? Because if you are focused on activism when you're supposed to be pursuing the truth, well, yeah, that actually doesn't mean anything good, because you start with preferred outcomes and preferred conclusions and end up trying to twist evidence into supporting that conclusion rather than finding out whether what you think is correct is actually correct. And that makes postmodernist thought and the postmodernist activism the antithesis of science. Hence the reason why Scientific American is really unscientific at this point. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and all that good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. Stay curious.